She was crouched so still behind the old barn wall that she might have been mistaken for a shadow, if shadows could tremble. Mamie Graves pressed her back against the weathered planks, her knees pulled to her chest, her breath coming in shallow, silent pulls. Her fingers were wrapped around the small carpet bag she had carried 300 miles, and inside that bag was the only thing standing between her and a man who believed he owned her. The sun had dropped below the ridgeline 20 minutes ago, and the Nevada sky had turned the color of a bruise, purple and mean and fading fast. Somewhere across the open range, she could hear horses, more than one, moving in a deliberate, sweeping pattern that told her everything she needed to know. They were searching. She had bought herself maybe 2 hours when she slipped off the stagecoach 3 stops early, in the tiny railroad junction town of Callow Creek, and she had used most of those 2 hours walking the ridgeline on foot, keeping to the creek bed where the water would wash away her boot prints. She had found the Bancroft ranch by accident, following the fence line in the dark, and she had not dared knock on the farmhouse door because she did not know whose men might already be inside. So she had done the only thing she could think of. She had folded herself into the gap behind the barn, where the old stone well had heaved the earth up and left a hollow just wide enough for a woman to disappear. She heard the barn door open. A long blade of lantern light cut across the dirt, and she stopped breathing entirely. Boots. Heavy, unhurried. The kind of footfall that belonged to a man who was comfortable in the dark, who owned the ground beneath his feet. They came around the corner of the barn and the lantern swung, and for one terrible second the light found her, and she looked up into a face she had never seen before. A broad jaw covered in dark stubble, eyes that caught the flame and held it, steady and unreadable. He was tall, wide through the shoulder, wearing a canvas duster with dried mud on the hem. A rancher, not one of Marshal Dent Corley's men. She could see that immediately in the way he held the lantern out to look at her rather than reaching for the pistol at his hip. He studied her for 2 full seconds. Then he looked out across the dark land in the direction from which he had just come, and he listened. She could see his jaw working, processing the same sound she had been tracking. The horses circling. The distant creak of saddle leather. He looked back at her. "Nobody finds you," he said, his voice low as a stone dropped into still water, "if they go through me." He blew out the lantern. That was how Mamie Graves came to trust Gideon Bancroft with her life before she even knew his name. 3 weeks earlier, in the city of Sacramento, California, in the late spring of 1882, Mamie Graves had been a woman with a plan. She was 24 years old, the daughter of a failed land speculator who had died the previous winter, leaving her nothing but debts, a trunk of dresses that were slightly too fine for poverty and slightly too threadbare for respectability, and a sharp, practical mind that had kept her employed as a bookkeeper for the last 2 years. She was not beautiful in the soft, conventional way that Sacramento society preferred, but she was striking, with dark copper hair that she kept pinned, gray eyes that noticed things people wished she hadn't noticed, and a quality of stillness that men found either calming or unnerving, depending on what they were trying to hide. She had been trying to leave. Not just Sacramento, not just California. She had been trying to leave the orbit of a man named Victor Alden, who was 43 years old and owned 3 freight companies, 2 judges, and a territorial marshal by the name of Dent Corley. Victor Alden had decided, 6 months after her father's death, that Mamie Graves would be an excellent addition to his household, not as a wife. Victor Alden had made that clear with the particular casualness of a man who has never been refused anything. He had made arrangements. He had spoken to her landlady. He had left gifts at her boarding house door that she had returned unopened, and then he had stopped being subtle about it entirely. The last thing he had said to her, 2 weeks before she fled Sacramento, was quiet and reasonable and more frightening than shouting would have been. He had said that a woman alone, with no family, no money, and no protector, was a woman who belonged to whoever decided to claim her. He had said it the way a man states a fact about weather. And then he had smiled and tipped his hat and walked away, and she had understood with complete clarity that she had perhaps 1 month before the arrangement he had described became real, whether she agreed to it or not. She had spent that month moving money she didn't have and selling the things she did. The dresses that were too fine went first, to a dressmaker on K Street who didn't ask questions. Then the silver-handled brush that had been her mother's and the small cameo brooch, and 3 books that a professor at the university had paid her $4 for without blinking. By the end of the month she had $62, a train ticket to Reno, and a plan that was more desperate than she preferred to admit. She knew a woman in Nevada, or she had known her once. A schoolmate from childhood named Clara Holt, who had married a rancher and moved east of Reno into the high desert country, and who had written her one letter, 2 years ago, describing a life that sounded hard and beautiful and entirely free of men like Victor Aldane. Mamie had written back, once. She was not certain the letter had arrived. She was not certain Clara would remember her, but she had $62 and a name, and she was out of better options. What she had not anticipated was Dent Corley. Victor Aldane's marshal had been waiting at the Reno train station. Not obviously. He was not the kind of man who made scenes in public. But she had spotted him through the train window as they pulled into the station, recognizing the particular angle of his hat and the width of his shoulders, and she had felt the cold drop of pure terror in her stomach. She had not gotten off in Reno. She had stayed on the train to the next stop, which was a small junction called Pallister, and there she had climbed onto a stagecoach heading northeast toward Callow Creek, and she had paid with coins from the lining of her boot because she did not want the ticket seller to remember her name. But Corley was good at his work. That was the problem with being owned by a man who could afford the best. He had found someone on the train who had seen her, and by the time the stagecoach left Pallister, he had turned his horse in the right direction. She had felt it, like weather in her bones, somewhere around the 3rd hour of the ride. The way the driver had glanced back at her. The way the 2 other passengers, a dry goods merchant and his wife, had suddenly become very interested in the floor. She had gotten off at the next stop, a water tower and not much else called Sequin Crossing, and she had walked into the desert without looking back. That was how she had ended up behind the barn. And that was where, in the profound darkness of a Nevada spring night with the lantern blown out and the sound of Corley's men on the ridge, she heard Gideon Bancroft say, low and calm, "Don't move from this spot." She didn't. She listened to him walk away from her, around to the front of the barn, and a moment later she heard his voice carry clearly across the yard, easy and unhurried, the voice of a man with nothing to hide. "Evening, you boys lose something," she heard Corley's voice, which she recognized from Sacramento, smooth and professionally pleasant. "Looking for a woman friend, traveling alone, dark red hair. Seen anyone matching that description?" "Can't say I have," Gideon said. "Come through on the road." Stage dropped her somewhere between Pallister and here. "Road's public," Gideon said. "Woman's allowed to ride a stage wherever she pleases." There was a pause, and when Corley spoke again his voice had a careful, deliberate quality. "She's wanted for questioning in a property matter, Sacramento jurisdiction." "Well," Gideon said, with the particular tone of a man who believes exactly none of what he is being told, "if I see anyone, I'll be sure to direct them to the proper authorities. You boys have a safe ride." She pressed herself against the barn wall and heard the horses turn. She counted their hoofbeats until they faded. She counted the silence after that. She counted to 20 beyond the silence, and then she heard the boots again, and the barn door opened and the lantern came back to life, and Gideon Bancroft came around the corner of the barn and crouched down to her level. Up close he was younger than she had initially assessed, perhaps 30 or 31, with the kind of face that had been weathered by outdoor work rather than years. His eyes, she could now see, were a dark, warm brown, the color of creek water over sandstone. He had a long, straight nose and a mouth that looked like it had been designed for a different expression than the grave one it was currently wearing. "How many are there?" he asked. "At least 4 riders," she said, "possibly a 5th if the marshal himself is with them." "That would be the man I was just talking to," Gideon said. "So yes, 5. He looked at her bag. "You running from the law or from a man who's bought himself some law?" She met his eyes. "The second," he nodded slowly. "You hungry?" She had not eaten since Pallister. "Yes." "Come inside," he said. He stood and offered her his hand, and she took it without hesitation because there was no room left in her body for pride. His name was Gideon Bancroft, and he had owned the Bancroft Ranch outright for 4 years, since his father had passed and left it to him and his younger sister, Ada, who had since married and moved to Carson City. The ranch ran about 800 acres of high desert grass and alkali flat, with 300 head of cattle, a small horse operation, and a bunkhouse currently occupied by 2 hands named Rupert and Cal, who were away in Callow Creek for the night and would be back by morning. He told her all of this over cornbread and cold beans, which he warmed on the cast iron stove while she sat at the long kitchen table and watched him with the careful attention of a person who is trying to determine whether they have leaped from one danger into another. He was not trying to impress her. That was the first thing she noted. He was doing exactly what needed to be done, in the order it needed to be done, without ceremony. He put food on the table, filled a cup with water from the pump, and sat down across from her and waited while she ate. He did not stare at her. He did not fill the silence with reassurances that she had not asked for. He simply sat and drank his coffee and let her eat, and she understood after several minutes that he was giving her the room to decide what she wanted to say next. She decided to be honest, because there was no tactical advantage to anything else. She told him about Victor Alding. She told him about Dent Corley and the arrangement that had been made without her consent. She told him about the $62, now reduced by stage fare to $41, and about Clara Holt and the unanswered letter, and the fact that she had no idea if anyone was expecting her. Gideon listened to all of it without interrupting. "Clara Holt," he said when she finished. "She'd be Clara DeVere now. Married Tom DeVere about 3 years back. They're on a homestead about 12 miles north of here up near the Juniper Breaks." Mamie set down her spoon. "You know her. Small county," he said. "Tom buys a bull from me every other year." He looked at the window, which was dark and still. "He's a decent man. Clara's settled in well out here." He paused. "I can take you to her tomorrow. Tonight you sleep in Ada's old room." "You don't know me," she said. It came out less accusatory than she intended and more bewildered. He looked at her directly then, in a way he had not quite done yet, and she felt the quality of that gaze like a hand placed flat against her sternum. "I know enough," he said. "A woman doesn't hide behind a barn in the dark unless she's got serious reasons, and the kind of man who sends riders out at night to chase a woman across the desert doesn't deserve the benefit of the doubt." She thought about this. "He's going to keep looking," she said. "I know it," Gideon said, "which is why we start early." She slept in Ada's old room, in a bed with a quilt that smelled like cedar and lavender, and she slept more deeply than she had since before her father died. She did not examine this too carefully. She simply let it be true. In the morning, she woke to the sound of the ranch already in motion. Through the small window she could see the pale gold of very early light over the desert hills, and she could hear the low, rhythmic sounds of a working morning, the swing of a door, the clank of a bucket, the distant complaint of a horse being harnessed. She dressed quickly, pinned her hair, and came downstairs to find Gideon at the stove and 2 men she had not yet met at the table. Rupert was short and barrel-chested and somewhere in his 40s, with a sunburned face and the unhurried manner of a man who had done his particular job for a very long time. Cal was younger, perhaps 22, with sandy hair and an open, curious expression that he was clearly trying to make less obvious. Gideon introduced her simply as a friend of Clara DeVere's who needed a ride north. Rupert nodded as though this were entirely unremarkable. Cal nodded and then looked at his plate with great interest. Over breakfast, which was eggs and salt pork and more cornbread, Gideon told her quietly that Corley's riders had come through the road again just before dawn. Rupert saw them from the bunkhouse window, he said, keeping his voice low. They doubled back. That tells me they're not convinced. They won't stop, she said. Victor Alding doesn't tolerate the word no. No, Gideon said, but he's got a long reach and not infinite patience, and he's operating a long way from his jurisdiction. He looked at her over the rim of his coffee cup. We just need to get you established somewhere. Once you're settled with the De Veres in front of witnesses with no legal cause for detention, it gets a lot harder for a Sacramento man to make a case. She looked at him. You've thought about this carefully. Been thinking since last night, he admitted. They left the ranch at sunrise, with Gideon driving a buckboard and Mamie seated beside him under the shade of the wagon's half canopy. He had suggested she wear one of Ada's older work bonnets, which was a practical precaution she was grateful for. The road north ran through a long valley between two ridges of sage-covered hills, and in the early morning light it was extraordinarily beautiful, the kind of beauty that felt slightly cruel given her circumstances. The hills were the color of old bronze, and the sky above them was so purely blue it seemed almost impossible. They did not talk much for the first hour. She was watching the road behind them and he was watching the road ahead, and they were both doing the same calculation about the same threat without needing to say so aloud. Then he said, with no particular preamble, "What did you do before, for work?" "Bookkeeping," she said, "for a dry goods wholesale company. Before that I taught school for 2 years in a town called Millbridge." "You like teaching," she considered. "I like the children more than I like the school board," she said. "The children were honest. The board mostly wanted to make sure I wasn't teaching anything that would give the girls ideas." The corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, but it was the architecture of one. "Did you give the girls ideas?" She looked at him. "Constantly." This time he did smile, briefly and entirely, and it changed his face considerably. She found herself wanting to say something that would produce it again, and then felt faintly ridiculous for the impulse. He told her in pieces over the course of the ride about the ranch. It was not boastful. He spoke about the work the way she had spoken about teaching, with honesty about both what he loved and what was difficult. The cattle operation was holding steady, but the price per head had dropped 2 years running. The horse breeding was newer, and he had hopes for it. The land itself he spoke of with a plainness that was almost tender, the way a person speaks about something they love without wanting to be seen doing it. She told him about Sacramento. Not about Aldane, not yet, but about the city itself, the way it had grown in the 12 years since the railroad had come through, the neighborhood she knew best, the bakery near her boarding house where the owner's wife, a woman from Portugal, made small sweet cakes on Saturdays that cost 2 cents and tasted like something from a different world entirely. "You miss it," he said. "Parts of it," she said. "Not the situation." They came over a low rise and she saw the juniper brakes ahead of them, a scattered band of twisted junipers along a dry creek bed, and beyond them, smoke rising from a low stone chimney. The De Vere homestead was modest but solid, a house of adobe and rough-hewn timber, a small barn, a kitchen garden surrounded by a low fence of stacked rocks. Clara Holt, who was now Clara De Vere, came out of the house before the buckboard had fully stopped, wiping her hands on her apron, squinting into the light. She was a tall, fair-haired woman with a kind, wind-chapped face and the kind of directness that Mamie had always liked about her, even as children. "Mamie Graves," she said. "Lord in heaven." "Hello, Clara," Mamie said. And then Clara had her hands and was looking at her with an expression that mixed joy and alarm in roughly equal proportions. Tom De Vere came around from the barn side, a solid, quiet man in his mid-30s who listened to the situation with the same steady attention that Gideon had shown the night before. He and Gideon exchanged a few words while Clara brought Mamie inside and put the kettle on and listened to the whole story over the table with her chin in her hands and her eyes growing progressively more determined. "You'll stay here," Clara said. "That's settled." "I don't want to bring trouble to your door," Mamie said. "You didn't bring it," Clara said firmly. "It was already in the world. You just need somewhere to stand while we deal with it." She had the kind of moral certainty that made complex situations feel simple, and Mamie was grateful for it. Gideon stayed for lunch, and afterward Mamie walked with him to his buckboard while Clara and Tom were inside. The day had warmed into genuine heat, and the sage all around them was releasing its sharp, dry scent in the sun. "Thank you," she said, "for last night, and for this morning." He stood with his hat in his hand, turning it by the brim. "It's not enough," he said. "Corley knows you're in this county. He'll start asking around." "I know. I'll be back in a few days," he said. "I want to check on how things stand." She looked at him. "You don't have to." "I know I don't," he said, in a tone that did not invite further argument on the subject. And then he put his hat on, climbed up onto the buckboard, and drove back south through the junipers. She stood and watched the wagon until it was out of sight, and then she stood a moment longer looking at the empty road. Dent Corley came to the DeVere homestead on the fourth day. He came alone, which was either a sign of confidence or a deliberate choice to seem non-threatening. And he was dressed neatly, in a good jacket, with a badge that read Sacramento City Marshal clearly visible. He was a lean man in his late 40s, with a gray mustache and eyes that were very pale blue and very still, the kind of eyes that gave nothing away while taking everything in. Tom DeVere met him in the yard. Mamie watched from inside, through the narrow window beside the door, while Clara stood at the table pretending to knead bread with both hands working slowly. Corley explained to Tom that he was following up on a property matter involving a woman named Mamie Graves, who was believed to be somewhere in the area. Tom listened with the particular blank politeness of a man who has decided in advance to know absolutely nothing. "Property matter," Tom repeated. "What kind of property?" "Financial," Corley said. "There's a matter of some debts contracted by her late father that Mr. Alding of Sacramento is seeking to resolve." "And the woman herself," Tom asked, "is she charged with anything?" A pause. "She is sought for questioning, but not charged." Another pause. "At this time, no." "Well," Tom said, "a woman who's not charged with anything has a right to go where she pleases, I'd think, and I haven't seen anyone matching that description. But if I do, I'll be sure to mention that there are interested parties looking for her." He said this with perfect courtesy and perfect insincerity, and Corley understood it completely, and they both understood that they understood it. Corley left. Clara let out a long, slow breath. "He'll be back," she said. "I know it," Mamie said. Gideon came back on the fifth day, as he had said he would, driving the buckboard with a bundle of supplies that he had apparently bought in Callow Creek without being asked. He spoke with Tom for a while, then came inside and sat at the table, and Mamie told him about Corley's visit. His expression did not change dramatically, but she had already begun to learn the subtle vocabulary of his face. The slight deepening of the line between his brows, the way his jaw set. "He's building a case," Gideon said. "Not a legal one, a social one, getting people to confirm you're in the area. Then he can claim he has a credible report of your whereabouts and request assistance from the county sheriff." "Can the county sheriff compel me to go with him?" she asked. "Without a charge or a warrant, no," Gideon said. "But Sheriff Aldous Crane in Callow Creek is a decent man. If Corley shows him something that looks official enough, Crane might feel obligated to bring you in for questioning just to prove his cooperation. He wouldn't mean you harm, but the end result would be the same." She pressed her lips together. "I need to establish a reason to be here," she said. "Something that gives me standing, a job, a position." Gideon looked at the table for a long moment. Then he looked up at her. "I need someone to handle my accounts," he said. "The ranch books have been a mess since my father's time. I've been doing them myself, and they're not right." She recognized this offer for what it was and was grateful that he had dressed it as usefulness rather than charity. "That's real work," she said carefully. "It's very real work," he said. "I pay Rupert and Cal fair wages. I'd pay you fair wages." She hesitated for another beat, and then something shifted inside her, the last remnant of the particular pride that had been causing her to hesitate. "When would you need me to start?" "Soon as you like," he said. She moved into Ada's old room at the Bancroft Ranch within the week, with Clara DeVere's blessing and Tom's assurance that she could ride back to them at any hour of the day or night if she needed to. She brought her carpetbag and the trunk of dresses that had survived the journey, and she set up in Ada's room with its cedar wardrobe and the window that looked east over the sage flats toward where the mountains turned blue in the distance. The accounts were, as Gideon had described, a genuine mess. Not through any negligence exactly, but because his father had kept records the way some men keep everything, with a logic that made complete sense to him and to no one else. Mamie sat at the kitchen table with 3 years of ledgers and a pot of coffee, and gave herself 2 full days to understand the system before she began to impose order on it. Gideon came in and out of the kitchen throughout the day, tracking dust and occasionally looking over her shoulder with the careful expression of a man who wants to understand what he's looking at but won't pretend to more comprehension than he has. "This column," she said on the second day, tapping a figure with her pencil. "Your father was running a credit arrangement with the feed merchant in Callow Creek. Did you know that?" "Vaguely," he said. "You've been paying it," she said, "but not consistently because you didn't know the exact terms. The merchant has been adding interest." She showed him the figures. "You owe him less than you think you do. I'll write him a letter." He looked at the numbers and then at her. "You found that in 2 days." "It's what I do," she said simply. The days settled into a rhythm that felt, despite everything, remarkably like ordinary life. She worked on the accounts in the morning, and in the afternoons she began to help where she could, which started with the kitchen garden that had been severely neglected and expanded gradually. She was not a rancher, but she was not useless, and she had a quality that Rupert, who was not a man for compliments, described to Cal as not complaining when something needs doing. Gideon watched her, she knew, not in the way that made her uncomfortable, not the assessing, proprietary way she had learned to recognize from men like Aldane. He watched her the way she had noticed him watching the weather on the ridge or the condition of the far pasture fence, with the concentrated attention of someone who cares about what they are observing and wants to understand it correctly. She watched him too. She noticed that he was up before anyone else every morning, not because he had to be, but because he chose to be, and that there was something he did every morning at first light that she eventually identified as simply standing outside the barn door for 5 minutes, looking east. Not doing anything, just looking. She asked him about it once, obliquely, and he said that his father had done the same thing every morning of his life, and that it was the only quiet in the day, and she understood that completely. She noticed that he was unfailingly fair with Rupert and Cal, not in a performed, self-conscious way but genuinely, treating their opinions as worth hearing and their time as worth respecting. She noticed that he never talked about himself unless asked, and that when he was asked, he answered honestly and without embellishment. She noticed that when he laughed, which was not frequent, it was entirely genuine and completely transformed his face, and that she had begun actively collecting the things that made it happen. A story about a mule that had once escaped Rupert's care and turned up in Callow Creek, standing in front of the dry goods store as though waiting to make a purchase. A particular comment she made about the ledger's least explicable entry, which was recorded only as miscellaneous goat. The time Cal tried to explain to her how to tell if a fence post was properly set and got thoroughly confused by his own explanation. 3 weeks after she had moved to the ranch, Dent Corley came back, not alone this time. He came with Sheriff Aldous Crane of Callow Creek, and a document that he presented to the sheriff as a warrant, though she would later learn it was not a warrant in any legally valid sense, but rather a letter from a Sacramento judge who was in Victor Aldane's pocket, and that the letter's jurisdiction over the state of Nevada was entirely invented. She did not know any of this when she heard the horses in the yard. She came to the door and saw Corley and Crane and two riders behind them, and she felt the familiar cold certainty of a trap closing. But Gideon was already in the yard. He had come from the pasture, and he stood between the house and the riders with his thumbs hooked in his belt, listening to what Corley had to say. She could not hear the conversation from the doorway. She watched Gideon's back, the set of his shoulders, and she read everything she needed to from the way he stood. He was not afraid. He was not angry. He was something more controlled than either, something that was paying very close attention. She came out of the house and stood behind him, and when Corley saw her, his eyes moved to her with the flat, professional satisfaction of a man who has successfully tracked something he was paid to find. "Miss Graves," Corley said, "I'd appreciate a word." "She's on my land," Gideon said before she could speak. "Employed by me. Any word you want with her you have in front of me." Crane cleared his throat. He was a heavy-set man in his 50s, clearly uncomfortable. "Mr. Bancroft, this document from Sacramento, may I see it?" Gideon asked. Crane handed it over. Gideon read it slowly and carefully. She could see from his expression that he was doing the same thing she had done with the ledgers, looking for the logic beneath the presentation. "Sheriff," Gideon said, handing the document back, "this letter is from a Sacramento judge. It references Sacramento jurisdiction. Unless Miss Graves committed an offense in Sacramento, which she has not, this letter gives you no authority to compel her presence anywhere." He paused. "And if there were a valid Nevada warrant, it would come from a Nevada judge, through your office directly, not through a private marshal from another state." Crane looked at the document again. He looked at Corley. "He's not wrong," he said. Corley's pale blue eyes moved between Gideon and Mamie with a quality of recalculation. "Mr. Bancroft," he said, "the gentleman Mr. Alding represents is a man of considerable influence." "I'm sure he is," Gideon said. "I'm a rancher in a county where that influence doesn't extend. Is there anything else?" There was not that day. But she knew, watching Corley ride away, that this was not finished. A man like Victor Alding did not accept being told no by a Nevada rancher. He would find another angle. He would find something with more legal weight behind it, real or manufactured, and he would come back with it. That night after supper, she stayed at the table after Rupert and Cal had gone to the bunkhouse, and Clara and Tom, who had driven down to spend the night, had gone to bed in the spare room. She and Gideon sat at either end of the table with the lamp between them, and for a while neither of them said anything. "He's going to manufacture something," she said at last. "Yes," Gideon said. "If he can get a territorial court to issue something, even on false grounds, it becomes much harder to resist." "Yes, so we need to do something before that happens," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said carefully, not looking at her, "There is one thing that would make it extremely complicated for Alding to claim any kind of legal standing over your movements or your affairs." She looked at him. He was still looking at the table. A muscle moved in his jaw. "If you were married," he said, "legally married in this county to a Nevada resident, your husband's legal residence would be your legal residence. Sacramento jurisdiction would have no claim on you at all. And your husband's affairs would be your affairs, including the right to live and work on his property without interference." The lamp flame moved in a faint draft. She could hear the night sounds of the desert outside, the distant call of something wild and faint. "That's a very large step," she said. "I know it is," he said. He looked up then, and his eyes on hers were direct and open in a way that she had come to recognize as the deepest version of his honesty. "I'm not proposing it as a legal maneuver. I mean, I am because it would serve that purpose, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But I'm also—" He stopped. He started again. "I am proposing it because I want to. Because in the 3 weeks you've been here I have found more to admire about you than I have found in most of the years that came before, and I am aware that this is neither the right moment nor the right circumstances for that to be a meaningful thing to say." She looked at him for a long, measured moment. "Why is it not a meaningful thing to say?" He blinked once. "Because you're in a difficult position and I don't want you to feel—" "Gideon," she said. She had used his first name, and it settled something in the room. "I am in a difficult position." I'm also an adult woman with a working mind, and I know the difference between a decision I'm making under duress and a decision I'm making because it's the right one." She paused. "I have been watching you for 3 weeks. I have noticed things about you that I did not expect to notice about anyone. And if I am being entirely honest, which I am inclined to be with you, I have been considerably warmer in my feelings toward you than is strictly comfortable given the circumstances." Something shifted in his face, a softening, a kind of careful, held-breath quality. "Then yes," he said. "Then yes," she said, "on the condition that it's a real marriage, not a paper one." "That's all I'd want it to be," he said. They were married 10 days later in Callow Creek, at the office of Justice of the Peace Howard Finley, with Sheriff Aldous Crane and Clara and Tom DeVere as witnesses. It was a plain ceremony in a room that smelled like tobacco and ledger ink, and Mamie wore her best remaining dress, which was deep green wool with ivory buttons, and Gideon wore a clean white shirt and a jacket she had not seen before, and Finley read the words from his book and they said what they needed to say, and that was that. Afterward, Clara embraced her outside the justice's office with her usual directness. "Are you happy?" she asked quietly in her ear. "Remarkably," Mamie said, and meant it. They drove back to the ranch in the late afternoon, and the desert was doing something extraordinary with the light, turning everything amber and rose and gold, and the sage threw long shadows across the road. She sat beside him on the buckboard as she had on that first ride, but everything was different now, and both of them knew it, and neither of them quite knew how to move into the new version of things. At the ranch, Rupert had apparently received some advance notice from Cal, because there was a bottle of decent whiskey on the kitchen table and a proper supper of roasted chicken that smelled extraordinary, and both men appeared briefly, congratulated them with maximum brevity, and retreated to the bunkhouse with a speed that suggested they had coordinated this in advance. She and Gideon ate supper quietly, and the quietness was a different kind than before, warm instead of cautious. He poured them each a small measure of the whiskey. She was not a regular drinker, but she took it and they held their glasses without speaking and looked at each other across the lamp, and she felt the particular kind of happiness that she had not entirely believed in until very recently, the kind that is simple and immediate and not borrowed from anywhere else. "I should tell you something," she said, "before anything else, honestly." "All right," he said. "I have been more frightened in the past month than I have ever been in my life," she said. "Not just of Aldine or Corley, of everything, of being entirely alone, without a claim anywhere in the world, of being a woman in a situation where the law and the money are both on the wrong side." She paused, "And I want you to know that you were the first thing that stopped that fear, even before I knew who you were. That night behind the barn when you blew out that lantern. That was the first moment in a very long time when someone put themselves between me and something dangerous, and it wasn't because they wanted something from me." He was very still, listening. "I don't know exactly what this is yet," she said, "between us. It's been fast and it's been strange and I don't want to describe it inaccurately, but I know it's real. Whatever it is, it's real." "It's real," he agreed quietly. She reached across the table and put her hand over his, and he turned his hand under hers and held it, and they sat like that for a while in the lamplight with the desert dark outside and the sound of the night wind moving through the sage. The letter from Victor Aldine arrived 3 weeks after the wedding. It came through Callow Creek's post office, addressed to Mamie Graves, which was the first mistake, because she was no longer Mamie Graves legally but Mamie Bancroft. Gideon took this detail to Howard Finley within the hour of reading the letter, which was written in Aldine's smooth, deliberate hand, and expressed, with remarkable control, his awareness that she had taken steps to complicate his interests and his sincere certainty that legal and financial pressure on her new husband's ranch operations would achieve what direct pursuit had not. Howard Finley was a sharp old man who had been practicing law before becoming a justice, and he read the letter twice and said, "This is a threat against a Nevada resident's livelihood, made in writing. That's actionable. "I don't want a court case," Gideon said. "I want it stopped." "Then we write him a letter," Finley said, "through proper channels, from the county attorney's office, informing Mr. Alding of Sacramento that any interference with the Bancroft Ranch or its operations, or any further harassment of its residents, will result in a formal complaint to the California State Bar regarding the conduct of his retained legal counsel, and a federal complaint regarding the misuse of a public marshal's resources for private purposes." He looked at them both over his spectacles. "Dent Corley is a Sacramento City Marshal. What he's been doing out here is almost certainly not authorized by his actual employer, which is the city, and I suspect that fact, made apparent to the right people, would cause considerable problems for Mr. Alding." Mamie looked at him. "Would it work? Men like Alding operate in the shadows," Finley said. "The surest way to end their operations is to put a lamp to them." He folded the letter. "Give me 2 days." The letter went out through the county attorney, copied to the office of the California State Attorney General, and to the Sacramento City Council. Dent Corley, it turned out, had indeed been operating entirely outside his authorized capacity, using Marshall's resources and official-looking documentation for a private commission. The city of Sacramento, informed of this by an official letter from a Nevada county attorney, proved strongly disinclined to share in the legal exposure and moved swiftly to address the matter internally. Victor Alding, whose wealth and influence were considerable but who had always operated in the carefully maintained appearance of legality, discovered that the appearance was harder to maintain when someone was actively pointing a lamp at it. He did not come after them again. She learned this not through any dramatic announcement but through a gradual anticlimactic fading, the way bad weather moves off without ceremony when the pressure shifts. The riders stopped appearing on the road. The inquiries in Callow Creek stopped. The threat, which had been so enormous and so constant for so long, simply retreated. It left a strange lightness in its wake, like the feeling after a long illness, when you realize one morning that the weight is gone. She sat in the kitchen one June morning with the accounts balanced and the letters answered, and the windows open to a breeze that smelled like rain coming from the west, and she understood that she was safe. Not in the provisional, qualified, one-eye-open way she had been safe for the past months, actually safe, settled, in a life that was hers. She went to find Gideon. He was in the far pasture, checking the fence line, which was his habit on Wednesday mornings. She walked out through the sage with her skirt getting dusty at the hem and found him crouched by a corner post, testing the tension on the wire with his gloved hand. He looked up when he heard her coming, and the expression on his face when he saw her crossing the pasture toward him was one that she would carry in her memory for the rest of her life. It was simple and complete and entirely unguarded, a man looking at someone he loves. "It's over," she said when she was close enough. "I can feel it." "I think you're right," he said. She stopped in front of him and he stood up and they looked at each other in the morning light in the middle of the pasture with the mountains to the east and the open country all around them. "I want to tell you something," she said, "without any reasons attached to it. No threats, no circumstances, no practical logic." "All right," he said. He had taken off his gloves and they hung from his belt. "I love you," she said. "I have loved you, I think, since you blew out that lantern, since you chose to put yourself between a stranger and something dangerous without needing to know why. That kind of person," she stopped, took a breath. "That kind of person is rare, and I want you to know that this isn't gratitude. I know the difference." He reached out and touched her face, his thumb moving along her cheekbone with the concentrated tenderness of someone who is being very careful with something that matters to them enormously. "I know you know the difference," he said. "That's one of the things I love about you." "How many things are there?" she asked. "I've been counting since the miscellaneous goat entry," he said, and she laughed, and he did too, and he bent his head and kissed her there in the pasture with the Nevada wind moving the sage all around them, and it was everything that a first real kiss in the light of an ended danger is supposed to be. The summer settled over the Bancroft ranch like a benediction. There was still hard work. There was always hard work on a working cattle operation in the high desert, and the summer brought its own particular demands. The cattle needed rotating through the pastures, and the water in the West Creek dropped lower than Gideon had seen it in 5 years, requiring extra work hauling from the main well. One of the horses, a young sorrel mare that Gideon had high hopes for, threw a shoe badly and needed the Callow Creek farrier and a week of careful tending. But the work was different now. She noticed this. It had weight and direction. She had begun to understand the ranch as a whole organism rather than a collection of tasks, and she found herself thinking about it even when she was doing something else, making small connections in her mind between the accounts and the pasture rotation and the water supply and the horse operation, and where the money was, and where it could be better spent. She brought these observations to Gideon in the evenings, at the supper table or on the porch in the blue hour before dark, and he listened to all of them with the same serious attention he brought to everything. They had good arguments sometimes. About the horse operation, which she thought could support more investment than he was willing to risk given the cattle income fluctuations, and which he thought she was underestimating in terms of physical and management cost. These arguments were productive and interesting, and neither of them held on to them, and she found that she loved arguing with him in the way she loved everything else about being in a life that was genuinely shared. He told her about his parents one evening, sitting on the porch in late July, with the stars coming out one by one over the eastern hills. His father had been a quiet man who worked with enormous consistency and loved the land with a depth he couldn't articulate. His mother had died when Gideon was 14, of a fever that took her in a week, and his father had never quite recovered from it, had simply worked harder and spoken less, and loved the children he had remaining with a focused, practical devotion that was its own kind of profound. "He would have liked you," Gideon said. "Why?" she asked. "You don't waste things," he said. Time or words or effort. He respected that above almost everything else. She had told him, by now, the whole of her history, including her father's failures and the particular loneliness of those last 2 years before she fled, and he had received all of it with the same quality he brought to receiving good news, without drama, with steady attention, making her feel that her history was simply the map of how she had become who she was, and that who she was a person he was glad to know. Clara and Tom came to dinner twice a month, and she and Clara developed the particular depth of friendship that comes from having been through something difficult together. Clara was funny in the dry, observational way of someone who has seen enough of life to find it genuinely absurd at regular intervals, and she and Mamie could talk for hours about anything and nothing, and Mamie noticed that Clara watched her and Gideon together with an expression of quiet satisfaction, as though something she had hoped for had happened exactly as she had hoped. Rupert and Cal were a constant presence, and she had developed genuine affection for both of them in quite different ways. Rupert she trusted the way she trusted the mountains, solid, permanent, reliable, with a dry humor that surfaced unexpectedly and was all the funnier for it. Cal was growing up in small, observable ways, getting more confident, asking better questions, and she sometimes gave him books from the small collection she had accumulated on the ranch, and noticed without commenting on it that he always returned them. In September, she began to suspect. She did not say anything for 2 weeks, partly from caution and partly from a private joy that she was not ready to share with anyone yet. She was not entirely certain, but her body was telling her something with increasing confidence, and she was good at listening to evidence when it presented itself clearly. She told Gideon on a Sunday evening at the end of a particularly long day, when they were sitting on the porch together in the cooling air with the last of the light going out of the sky. She simply took his hand and held it for a moment, and then she said, "I think we're going to need Ada's room for a different purpose, sometime around February." He was still for a moment. Then he turned to look at her with that open, unguarded expression that she loved most, the one that appeared when something happened that was better than he had allowed himself to expect. "Are you sure?" he asked, "Fairly sure," she said. "I'll be more certain in a few weeks, but fairly sure." He put his arm around her and pulled her close, and she rested her head against his shoulder, and they sat like that while the desert darkened around them and the first stars appeared and the nighthawks began their evening work above the sage. "A baby," he said quietly to himself, as though he was tasting the idea for the first time. "A baby," she confirmed. He pressed his lips to her hair. "You're remarkable," he said. "I think that's a cooperative achievement," she said, and felt him laugh against her. October brought a new challenge to the ranch, entirely unrelated to Sacramento or Victor Alding or any human threat, simply the hard arithmetic of weather and time. A long dry spell followed by a rapid early storm did significant damage to the north section of the fence, and 3 head of cattle got through the break before Rupert spotted it at dawn. They spent 3 days finding them, driving them back, repairing the fence, and assessing what other sections needed attention before the serious cold came. During those 3 days, while Gideon was working long hours on the range, and the bunkhouse lights were on before sunrise and after dark, Mamie ran the ranch from the kitchen with a completeness that surprised even her. She coordinated the supply deliveries, managed the communication with the Callow Creek feed merchant, made decisions about the remaining hay stores that she had been quietly managing, and that turned out to be in better shape than anyone had realized, and kept track of where every man was and what every section needed with a precision that Rupert, when he came in for supper on the second night, described as the best-run 3 days of trouble I've seen on this ranch in 20 years. When Gideon came in on the evening of the 3rd day, muddy and tired and thoroughly satisfied with the fence repair, she had supper ready and the lamp lit and a cup of coffee poured, and he sat down and looked at the neatly stacked notes she had kept on the supply usage and the daily decisions, and he went through them silently and methodically. And when he was done, he looked at her with an expression that she recognized as the particular mixture of admiration and affection that she had come to understand was his deepest form of compliment. "You ran this ranch," he said. "It ran itself," she said. "I just kept track of it." "Mamie," he said, "I mean this sincerely. You are the most capable person I have ever met." She felt warmth move up through her chest and into her face, and she looked at her hands because she was not entirely comfortable receiving compliments without deflecting them, which was a habit she was working on. "You're not so bad yourself," she said. He reached across the table and tipped her chin up with one finger until she was looking at him. "Get used to it," he said. "I intend to keep saying true things." November arrived, and with it Clara's announcement that she was also expecting, due in late spring, and the 2 women spent several afternoons together planning in the cheerful, practical way of people who have decided to be delighted by something regardless of what it requires. Clara's knowledge of childbearing out in the high desert country was more extensive than Mamie's, and she shared it generously along with the name of the midwife in Callow Creek, a woman named Agnes Story who was reportedly no-nonsense and very skilled. The ranch settled into its winter rhythms, which were slower but not easier, a different kind of work. The cattle needed different management in the cold, and the horses more careful watching. The shorter days had their own domestic quality, more time in the evenings, the lamp lit earlier, the fire going longer. She and Gideon developed the particular language of a marriage that is both partnership and deep feeling, the shorthand that develops between 2 people who spend their days working toward the same things and their evenings returning to each other. She knew his silences by type now. She knew the difference between the quiet of someone thinking through a problem and the quiet of someone who is tired but content, and the rarer, tenderer quiet of someone who is simply glad to be where they are. He learned her in ways that moved her unexpectedly. He learned that she needed a few minutes in the morning before she was ready for conversation, and he stopped trying to discuss ranch business at the breakfast table. He learned that, when she was worried about something she did accounts that didn't need doing, running the figures again and again, and that the correct response was to sit near her without asking questions until she was ready to talk. He learned that she found the stars over the Nevada desert genuinely consolatory in a way that was important to her, and he began, without making anything of it, to suggest they sit on the porch on clear evenings, even in the cold. She learned that he had a private stubbornness that was different from his public steadiness, a place in him where certain things were non-negotiable, and that the things that lived there were always things that mattered: loyalty, honesty, fairness, and that she loved this about him even when they argued about it. She learned that he had a slight weakness for well-made things, books, tools, a good knife, and that he experienced guilt about this that she found unnecessary and said so. She learned that he missed his father and his mother and Ada more in winter, and that he was careful about this, and she was careful back. Christmas arrived, and with it Ada herself, who traveled down from Carson City for 2 weeks with her husband, a quiet, pleasant man named Edward, and their 2-year-old daughter, who was a small, sturdy, absolute force of nature named Ruth. The house was full in a way that Mamie had not experienced since childhood, and she found that she loved it, the noise and the laughter, and the chaos of small Ruth learning that the Christmas tree was not edible despite her considerable interest in testing this hypothesis. Ada was nothing like she had expected, though she could see the family resemblance clearly enough. Where Gideon was measured and deliberate, Ada was quick and expressive, with a laugh that filled rooms and opinions that she delivered at considerable speed. She had taken Mamie's measure within about 15 minutes of arriving, with a directness that Mamie recognized as familial, and then she had relaxed entirely and been warm and generous and funny for the rest of the visit. On Christmas Eve, Ada cornered her briefly in the kitchen while the men were out with Ruth looking at the horses and said, "He's different, you know. He's been different since summer when I last rode him. Easier. Less," she searched for the word. "Less alone." "He seems very comfortable in his own company," Mamie said. "He is," Ada agreed. "That's not the same thing as not being lonely." She looked at her with her dark Bancroft eyes. "You're good for him. And he's very in love with you, in case you were wondering." "I wasn't wondering," Mamie said and smiled. "No," Ada said. "I can see that. Good." January brought the serious cold, and February brought the baby. He came on a Tuesday, in a snow that was light and quiet outside the window, and Agnes Story was there with her capable hands and her brisk, matter-of-fact manner, and Clara was there because Mamie had wanted her there, and Clara had shown up at dawn without being asked because she knew. Gideon stayed in the kitchen with what must have been extraordinary discipline, and she could hear him not pacing, which meant he was pacing very quietly. The baby was a boy, 7 pounds and something, with dark hair and a furious, healthy cry that filled the house on the cold February morning like the most welcome sound in the world. She heard Gideon come to the bedroom doorway and stop, and she looked up from where she held the baby against her chest, and the expression on his face was one she had no words for. It was the most open she had ever seen him. All of the careful steadiness dissolved into something pure and overwhelmed and grateful. He came to sit beside her on the bed, and he looked at the baby for a long, silent moment. "Hello," he said to the baby, in a voice so quiet it was almost not there. "What should we call him?" She asked. He had been thinking about this for weeks, but he hadn't said the name yet. He said it now. "James," he said, "for my father." "James Bancroft," she said, testing it. It settled into the room like something that had always been true. "Yes." He looked at her. His eyes were bright in a way she had not seen before. He said, "Thank you," which seemed insufficient and which was also everything. "We made him together," she said, which she had said before in a lighter context, but which was now something else entirely, true in every way that a thing can be true. Clara came to the doorway and looked in and said something that was partly a laugh and partly not, and Agnes Story declared the mother and child to be in excellent condition, and helped herself to the coffee that had been waiting in the kitchen, and the morning continued around them, ordinary and extraordinary at once. Spring came to the Bancroft Ranch with particular generosity that year, the creek running high from a good snowpack, the pastures greening up earlier than usual, the cattle moving out to the east sections with their calves new and uncertain, and very soon adventurous. Mamie watched all of it from the ranch with the particular double vision of someone managing a household with a new baby and a full ranch accounting operation, which was a considerable amount to track, but which she found she was managing through the same quality she had always brought to difficult logistics, paying attention to what actually needed attention, and not to what only seemed to. James was a bright, watching baby who was curious about everything within his limited range. Gideon, who had apparently been uncertain about babies in the abstract, turned out to be entirely comfortable with this specific baby, carrying him in the mornings while Mamie ate breakfast with both hands, which she described as a revolutionary luxury, and talking to him in the quiet, direct way he talked to everyone, including the horses. Clara had her baby in late May, a girl, and there was general celebration on both homesteads. The two women visited back and forth whenever the weather permitted, and their babies observed each other with the solemn mutual assessment of diplomats at a first meeting. By summer, the horse operation had grown to the point where Gideon was spending more of his attention on it, and the cattle side was running with enough established routine that Mamie, between the accounts and James and the kitchen garden that was now considerable, sometimes helped Cal with the smaller management tasks in a way that would have seemed implausible a year ago. She had put down roots the way desert plants do, not shallowly but deep and wide, through rock and hardpan, finding the water that was there. One August evening, after James had gone to sleep and the dishes were done and the last of the light was fading, she and Gideon sat on the porch as they always did, and she looked out at the Nevada desert going dark and blue around them, and she thought about the woman who had crouched behind a barn in the dark 8 months ago, terrified and alone, with $41 and a stranger's name on a piece of paper. "What are you thinking?" he asked. He had learned to ask, because her silences were not always the kind that needed company, and it was worth knowing which kind this was. "I'm thinking about what it would have been like," she said, "if any one part of it had been different. If I hadn't gotten off the stagecoach at Sequin Crossing, if I hadn't walked to the fence line, if you hadn't come out of the barn with a lantern." He was quiet for a moment. "I almost didn't," he said. "I've been up since before dawn. I was going to go directly to bed." She looked at him. "What made you go out?" "The horses were restless," he said. "I thought there was something in the yard." He paused. "There was," he said. She looked at him and he was looking at her, and the quality of the look was the kind that requires no addition. "Yes," she said, "there was." He reached out and took her hand, the same way she had reached across the table to him on that night after Corley's last visit, when everything had still been uncertain. She held it and felt the warm, callous solidity of it and leaned her head against his shoulder. The stars were coming out over the desert, one by one, the same stars that had been there the night she'd hidden, the same unchanging patterns over the same land, which was now her land too, her home, her life. James grew. The ranch grew. The horse operation that she had argued for and he had been cautious about turned out to be exactly as profitable as she had projected, and she accepted this vindication with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who has learned to enjoy being right without requiring anyone else to make a ceremony of it. He acknowledged it readily, and she loved him for the readiness. The seasons came around again. Another winter, another spring. Clara's daughter learned to walk at nearly the same time James did, and the two small people, turned loose in Clara's kitchen garden together, accomplished more creative destruction in 20 minutes than Mamie would have believed possible. She and Clara stood in the doorway watching them with expressions that mixed genuine alarm with considerable suppressed laughter. Tom DeVere and Gideon had developed a solid working friendship over the years, the kind built on shared labor and mutual respect, and the two families were as close as neighbors can be when they live 12 miles apart across high desert country. Which is to say, they were very close indeed. One spring evening, with James asleep and the house quiet and the fire low because the evening was warm enough to not need it high, Gideon came to find her at the kitchen table, where she had been working on the quarterly accounts. She looked up. He had that expression. the one she had learned to read as his version of significant news, carefully held until he was ready to deliver it properly. "What?" she said. "I've been thinking," he said. He sat down across from her. "The horse operation is established now. The accounts are solid. The ranches," he paused. "It's more than my father had at this point, which is not nothing." "No," she agreed. "It's not nothing. I want to expand the north pasture," he said. "There's a section of land adjacent to the juniper breaks that's been unclaimed since old Marsh Wilson died back in 1879. Tom looked into it, and it's available for homestead claim. If we filed, we could add another 200 acres of good grass." She looked at the accounts, which she knew as well as she knew anything, and did a rapid calculation. "We could do it," she said. "It would be tight for the first year, but the horse revenue would cover it." "That's what I calculated too," he said. He paused. "I wanted to check with you before I did anything." She looked at him. "It's your ranch." "It's our ranch," he said, with the simple, complete certainty of a man who has never for a moment thought otherwise. She looked at him for a moment, feeling that warmth again, the one she had felt at the kitchen table on their first real evening together, and had felt 10,000 times since in different forms and intensities. "Then yes," she said. "File for it." He did. The claim went through in June, and they celebrated with a supper that included Clara and Tom and the two small children and Rupert and Cal, and Finley from Callow Creek, who had been invited because he had been at the beginning of things and seemed right to have at this particular middle. It was a good evening. There was roasted beef and potatoes, and 2 kinds of pie that Clara had made and brought, and the conversation ran long and easy around the table. And James, who was 18 months old now and had recently discovered opinions, expressed them with great energy from his chair at the corner of the table, until he fell asleep mid-sentence with his face very close to a slice of apple pie. Afterward, she and Gideon sat on the porch while the guests filed out across the dark yard, and she looked at the stars above the juniper breaks, which were their land now too, 200 more acres of sage and grass and sky. "I have something to tell you," she said. He turned to look at her. She was very familiar with how his face did what it was currently doing, the slow shift from attentive to something that was the careful edge of hope. She had seen it in this context before. "February again," she said. He let out a long breath that was also somehow a laugh. He pulled her close and held her with both arms, and she could feel him smiling against her hair. "February," he said. "I know we haven't discussed whether—" "Yes," he said before she finished the sentence. "You don't know what I was going to say." "Whatever you were going to say, the answer is yes," he said. She laughed, and then she turned in his arms so she could look at him in the starlight, and he looked back. And she thought about dark secrets and hidden dangers and forced choices and the darkness behind a barn and a lantern going out, and how all of that had led in a straight, improbable, remarkable line to this porch and this man and this life. "You know," she said, "when I was hiding behind your barn, I was considering about 17 different ways that evening could go wrong. And I didn't consider this one," she said. "No," he said, "I don't think I would have either." She put her head against his chest and listened to his heartbeat, which was steady and calm as everything about him. And the Nevada night was wide and enormous and full of stars above them. And the ranch was quiet around them in the good way, the way of things that are resting and will continue. The second baby came in February, as promised, and was a boy again, which James received with the grave interest of someone not entirely sure what to make of new competition. They named him William, for no one in particular, because it seemed to suit him before he had been there an hour. A solid, comfortable name for a baby who was solid and comfortable from the first, and slept through the night within 8 weeks, which Agnes Story said was either a sign of excellent temperament or excellent luck, and which Mamie privately attributed to both. James accepted William eventually, in the way children accept inevitable facts, and by summer he had developed a proprietary interest in his brother that manifested as bringing him small objects of no particular value but great personal significance. A smooth stone, a dried sprig of sage, the end of a piece of rope, each offered with great seriousness. Gideon watched this ritual one July evening from the porch doorway, the two children on the sitting room floor, James presenting William with a very small stick, and his face did what it had been doing since James was born, that open, unguarded thing that she loved most. She came to stand beside him and they watched together, and she slipped her hand into his and he held it. The ranch accounts were the best they had been since she had taken over the ledgers, 3 years ago now. The horse operation was fully established, with a reputation in the county that had begun to reach beyond it. The north pasture was producing. Rupert was talking about retiring sometime in the next couple of years, and she and Gideon had discussed bringing on a third hand and possibly training Cal for a supervisory role, which Cal did not yet know about, and which she suspected would make him turn the color of the mesa at sunset when he found out. She had written a letter to Sacramento the previous year, to a woman she had worked with at the dry goods company, not because she needed to know what was happening there, but because she was at the point in her happiness where she could look back at the difficult things with something like equanimity. The woman had written back. Victor Aldane, she wrote, had been the subject of a California state inquiry regarding the misuse of public officials for private purposes. The inquiry had not resulted in criminal charges, but it had resulted in considerable public embarrassment and a measurable reduction in his political influence. Dent Corley had lost his marshal's appointment. The letter writer did not know where he had gone. She had read this letter to Gideon and then folded it and put it in the kitchen stove, not from any dramatic impulse, but simply because there was nothing in it she needed to keep. One evening in late August, when William was 6 months old and James was 2.5 and the summer was going out in a long, amber, generous fade, she sat at the kitchen table after supper with the ledgers in front of her and her pen in her hand, and a feeling that she could not immediately identify. She sat with it for a while, letting it be what it was. It was contentment, she finally recognized. Not the brittle, provisional kind, not the kind that requires everything to stay exactly as it is in order to maintain itself. The kind that has roots, the kind that knows what it's built from. Gideon came through the kitchen, checked on her, saw she was still working, and touched her shoulder as he passed, a small, habitual gesture, the kind that requires no name because it is simply part of the language of a life together. She put her hand over his for a moment, and then let him pass, and she looked down at the ledger and at the numbers in her own handwriting, and at the name at the top of the page, Bancroft Ranch, and she thought, yes. Outside, the Nevada desert was doing something magnificent with the last of the light, the way it always did, turning the sage silver and the hills to bronze, and the sky above the eastern mountains going from gold to rose to a deep, particular blue that was unlike any blue in any other place she had ever been. She closed the ledger. She went outside to watch the light change, and Gideon was already there, standing at the porch rail with his arms resting on it, looking out at the country the way he had looked at it every evening of his life. He made room for her and she leaned against the rail beside him, and they stood together in the cooling air with the smell of sage and the first coolness of the coming season in the wind. The stars were beginning, faint and then certain, one by one over the desert hills. She had run 300 miles from a man who had believed that a woman alone had no claim on her own future. She had folded herself into the dark behind a stranger's barn with $41 and a name on a piece of paper and the stubborn, undefeated conviction that her life was hers to live. And the stranger had come out with a lantern, and he had looked at her, and he had blown out the light. And now here they were, on the porch of a ranch in Nevada with 2 small boys asleep inside, and the horse operation doing better than projected, and the accounts in order and the night coming on soft and full of stars, and she was exactly where she had always been trying to get to without knowing what it was called or whether it was real. It was real. She looked at Gideon beside her, his profile against the last of the western light, steady and familiar and entirely beloved, and he turned as though he felt her looking, and the smile he gave her was the complete one, the rare and true one, the one she had been collecting since the night they met. She reached for his hand and he took hers, and they stood together in the evening while the stars multiplied above them and the Nevada night settled in, wide and safe and full of everything that mattered. That was how it was. That was how it stayed.